Good evening, welcome. My name is Carrie Marsh. I'm the director of the Clarke Historical Library, and the Clarke Speaker Series, of which this is our first of the new year, is one of our signature programs in the Clarke, and we're so grateful to have you all here this evening, so thanks. So I want to begin by acknowledging that today we're here on the beautiful lands maintained for generations by the Anishinaabe people, the indigenous inhabitants of Michigan, with whom we continue to partner today at CMU. So I want to give you a brief overview of the next couple of speaking events. On Tuesday, September 24th at 7 p.m. here in this auditorium, please join us for the David and Eunice Sutherland Burgess Lecture, which features Michigan's own Christopher Paul Curtis, whose historical novels for young people center on African American families and tackle tough issues with humor and honesty. So his work has received nearly all the Children's Literature Awards. He's the first African American man to win the Newbery Medal. And this year he was honored with the 2024 Coretta Scott King Virginia Hamilton Lifetime Achievement Award by the American Library Association. So hope you all can come to that because it's going to be amazing. Then on Tuesday, October 29th, 7 p.m. again in this room, Blair Morceau will give the John and Audrey Cumming Endowed Lecture. Morceau is a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi with ancestral ties to the Grand River Bands of Ottawa. And she's an assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Michigan State. She's going to draw upon her recent collection of essays that she edited to offer an examination of the thousands of years of indigenous knowledge that Simon Pokagon elevated in his stories, which were printed on birch bark around the turn of the 20th century. And if that doesn't entice you to come to that event, we'll have the Clarke's collection of the birch bark books out on display at the reception afterwards. So if you've never seen one, the little itty bitty birch bark books, that's going to be your opportunity to see them. So please join us for both of those events. So I have just a little bit of housekeeping, so please mute or turn off your cell phones. This event is recorded, and so by your presence here, you agree that we can put this recorded event online in CMU's platform, Chitcast. Because we're recording, we have a microphone for you to use to ask questions during the Q&A. When you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you, okay? All right, and so finally, after tonight's presentation, please join us in the Clarke for a reception with our speakers. All right? Alrighty, so here in 2024, we are 51 years out from the disaster that occurred at the Velsicol Chemical Corporation in St. Louis, Michigan in 1973, when the company shipped a fire retardant called PBB instead of nutritional supplement to a Farm Bureau livestock feed cooperative. This act led to a large-scale contamination that exposed farm animals, wildlife, and nearly 8.5 million Michiganders. Tonight's esteemed panel of speakers will reflect on what occurred and its aftermath and discuss efforts to document and commemorate community experiences. So I'm really pleased to introduce the panel to you. So first, Brittany Fremion is a professor in the Department of History, World Languages, and Cultures at Central Michigan University, where she teaches classes in environmental, women's, and public histories. From 2018 to 2020, she directed the Michigan PBB Oral History Project in collaboration with research and community partners. She is co-editor of the PBB Disaster at 50 essay collection and currently serves as chairperson for the Pine River Superfund Citizen Task Force, St. Louis, Michigan, and she's also a member of the Michigan PBB Registry Leadership Team. Next, we have Dr. Benjamin Peterson. Ben has worked as a lobbyist, union organizer, photographer, academic journal coordinator, elections official, public historian, and professor. Currently, he works at Alma College, helping to direct community-engaged learning and engagement and civil discourse programs. He's been the recipient of 2 Michigan Humanities Council grants, a Network for Vocation and Undergraduate Education grant, and most recently an EPA Environmental Justice Grant. And our third speaker this evening is Dr. Norm Keon. He has more than 55 years of experience as an epidemiologist, having worked for the former Michigan Department of Public Health and now Mid-Michigan District, Central Michigan District, and District Number 10 Health Departments. He's a founding member of and long-serving officer for the Pine River Superfund Citizen Task Force, as well as a member of Emory University's Michigan PBB leadership team and PBB Citizens Advisory Board. Dr. Keon has worked diligently to help document the history of the PBB disaster. As a lifelong resident of St. Louis, Michigan, he has many memories of the Michigan Chemical Corporation, now known as Velsicol, his hometown, and the Pine River watershed. So please welcome them with a round of applause.
Thank you. Hey, Carrie, you need help with that?
Oh, sure, of course.
Please. Okay, can you?
Just let me.
Yeah. Okay, testing. Can you all hear me? No. Oh, she did it, Norm. I learned this weekend that you never tap a microphone.
Why? That's how I tested it earlier.
Oh, testing. I can grab a mic.
Use this
I'll
one.
train.
Use this one.
Oh,
Sorry, I just
No,
replaced
that's
the
okay.
batteries. Maybe I did it dumbly.
Okay, I do need those. Thank you. Okay, if that's our only hiccup for tonight, then I think we're in good shape. Thank you all for being here this evening and helping us talk about a legacy contamination in Michigan that affected 8 to 9 million people at the time of the disaster, and today an estimated 40 million people, given the multi-generational impacts from this. So I'm Brittany Fremion. I'm a professor of history at CMU, and Carrie just gave you a really great overview of the many things I'm involved with tied to the PBB disaster. But I want to start with Joyce Egginton, who in the fall of 1974, as a British journalist, she was in London, she read an article in the New York Times about cows in Michigan who were sick from eating a fire retardant. So the week later, she got on a plane and came to Lansing, and she covered, as a foreign correspondent for The Observer, farmer protests at the state capitol. And she ended up spending the next 2 years coming back and forth between Michigan and New York and interviewing around 150 people about their experiences tied to the PBB disaster. And she ended up publishing in 1980, within the span of 5 or 6 years, this history, The Poisoning of Michigan, that's now in its second edition, and is probably the most comprehensive history of the disaster, and one that really helps to amplify community stories and experiences. So you'll notice in this quote, she makes a really important observation at the beginning of her book. She writes, "Although it remains one of the most widespread chemical contaminations this country has ever experienced, it is also the most underreported disaster I have known in a long journalist career punctuated by reporting on disasters." Why was the PBB disaster underreported? And why do so few Americans, albeit Michiganders, know about it? Why does this disaster that happened in the 1970s in our state matter? When Michigan Chemical Corporation opened in St. Louis, Michigan in 1936, it was almost immediately met with concern and outcry from residents of the watershed, the Pine River watershed and downstream in Saginaw, who were concerned about contamination that might come from the chemical firm and end up in the Great Lakes and in people's bodies. Unfortunately, that community foresight and concern didn't really stand a chance, because the company quickly grew, at first as a locally operated firm that expanded in the 1940s And then following World War II, benefited from a post-war economic boom, as well as federal funding and investments in the wonders, the chemical wonders of the atomic age. In 1965, Velsicol Chemical Corporation acquired a controlling share of Michigan Chemical and significantly expanded its production of synthetic chemicals, including the development of polybrominated biphenyl, or PBB, which is a fire retardant, and it was sold under the trade name Firemaster. In addition to manufacturing PBB and a couple hundred other compounds, the chemical firm produced magnesium oxide as a nutritional supplement. It was a topper for cattle feed for a ration that was meant to increase milk production. And they sold it under the trade name Nutrimaster. And you can see in the middle of the slide here, there's a bag with Firemaster and one that says Nutrimaster. These come from the film The Poisoning of Michigan. Very similar trade names, very similar labels. These two products were stored side by side in the same warehouse, right? Disaster was inevitable. You can see in the top photo an aerial shot of Michigan Chemical, which is located in St. Louis, Michigan, the geographic center of the Lower Peninsula, and right on the Pine River. Okay, so in 1973, sometime in the spring, we suspect that Michigan Chemical accidentally loaded a truck with PBB instead of Nutrimaster, the magnesium oxide. And over the course of the next 9 months to a year, farmers in Michigan started to notice a serious decline in the health of their animals. Thanks to this guy on the bottom here, this photo, this is Rick Halbert. He's a farmer out of the Battle Creek area. In his time before being a farmer, he was actually a chemist. And so on his farm, when he started to see differing health effects, ailments in his animals, he piloted a couple of studies, and he determined that it had to be the feed that he got from Farm Bureau Services feed mill that got the magnesium, what was supposed to be magnesium oxide and actually PBB from Michigan Chemical, and was able to then, send samples to countless labs across the country. Ended up connecting with a USDA scientist out of Beltsville, Maryland, who confirmed, in fact, by accident, someone left a mass spectrometer on for too long, and they got these brominated peaks, and discovered that it was, in fact, PBB. And so Halbert is credited with providing irrefutable proof that this disaster happened, and Michigan Chemical, or Velsicol Chemical as we know it today, was responsible for the disaster. Okay, so this is a very messy chart, and I have lots of colors on here. The red, point of origin for polybrominated biphenyls, right, which is used in wiring for lots of commercial appliances, right? It's supposed to end up going to these companies that are manufacturing TVs and all kinds of electrical appliances. But at the same time, Michigan Chemical is manufacturing PBB. They're also making Nutrimaster, the magnesium oxide, and it's getting into the Pine River and exposing residents of St. Louis. It's exposing chemical workers who take home the dust and other contaminants on their clothes and expose their families. And then it goes to Farm Bureau Services, and from there it contaminates cattle who are given the first batches of contaminated ration. It exposes the livestock, it exposes the farm, it contaminates the farm, and exposes the farmers. The people who buy products directly from those farms are exposed. And then the drums, the steel drums at these feed mills, they clean them with oils. Well, PBB is fat binding, so instead of actually cleaning out the drums, they were just reassuring that it was going to cross-contaminate everything else that went through there. And so it contaminated the chicken feed produce or products that ended up, for hogs, right, lambs, chicken, goats, and beyond. And from there, then the market, so Michigan groceries, and the general population. So this is a mass exposure. Again, 8 to 9 million people living in Michigan at the time of the disaster, with multi-generational effects. So just to give you another visual of how widespread this contamination was, at first there was uncertainty about what this meant for not only Michigan farms, but consumers. So the Michigan Department of Agriculture consulted with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to try to determine what an actionable level would be. So at what level could they quarantine farms, condemn animals, pull food off of grocery shelves to try to protect people's health? And they thought, well, PBB is similar to PCB, so we'll set it at 1 part per million. And then it became really clear quickly that, oh no, that's way too high, so they lowered it to 0.3, and then by August of 1977, is tied to some state legislation, they reduced it even further. So you can see how widespread this was based upon some research that an MPH student from Emory University did. The star locates the Superfund site, so the chemical farm where it's located in St. Louis, Michigan. The blue dot is the burial pit on public lands near Camp Grayling in southern Kalkaska County, where they disposed of condemned animals and foodstuffs. And then the green is Mayo, which this was a hotly contested burial site because the residents of Mayo saw what happened in Kalkaska and said, heck no, you're not burying those contaminated, condemned animals here. And they put up a year-long court fight. Okay, so what did this mean for Michigan farmers? Well, the farmers who were hit first were some of the biggest, most successful dairy operations, not just in the state, but in the country. And they had really high levels of PBB. And so they were quarantined really quickly. And the MDA at first was, telling farmers and reassuring consumers, it's just a small number of farms that are affected. But then they lowered the threshold pretty significantly, and enough so that some of those first farms end up re-quarantined. Well, then there are other farms that may have and did have visibly ill animals, but fell below that actionable level. And the Department of Agriculture and then the Department of Health reassured consumers and farmers, oh no, it's safe in these low doses, these quantities, these exposures. And so farmers that fell below that actionable level were forced with a really hard decision. Do I keep feeding these sick animals, keep them alive, and then sell these products into the marketplace? My livelihood, my family, we depend upon this. Or being reassured that it's okay to do so. Or I can't, they're so sick, it's so obvious. And those farmers then made the tough decision to euthanize their animals. Some of them did. Okay, so by numbers, by 1976, there are over 500 farms in Michigan that are quarantined. This amounts to like 30,000 head of cattle, 4,500 pigs, 1,500 sheep, 1.5 million chickens. Also destroyed were 800 tons of animal feed, 18,000 pounds of cheese, 2,500 pounds of butter, 5 million eggs, and 34,000 pounds of dried milk products. And again, those come from quarantine farms. That's not even touching the low-level farmers. Dubbed Cattlegate, this is the era of Watergate, the PBB disaster was characterized by a number of things. And two of the biggest things are uncertainty and inaction on behalf of public officials and agencies, and really coming up with a quick and effective response to this. At first, they blamed farmers. They said, no, this is poor husbandry. That's why your animals are sick. And then Rick Halbert, with the help of George Freese, says, actually, it's contaminated feed. That leads to farmer protests at the Capitol, like the one that drew Joyce Egginton to Michigan, that British journalist who wrote The Poisoning of Michigan. And it led to the formation of the PBB Action Committee. This was a group of low-level farmers. There were some quarantine farm families who were part of that organization, in addition to resident consumers who were really frustrated and fearful that they were purchasing and getting exposed by consuming goods that they bought from the local grocery stores. There were also early concerns about human health. There were some really important whistleblowers, people like veterinarian Dr. Alma College and Ted Jackson, who was actually Rick Halbert's veterinarian. Rick Halbert had concerns too. Dr. Tom Corbett was a physician, an anesthesiologist, and scientist with expertise in toxicology at the University of Michigan, who piloted some early rat studies to try to see what the long-term health implications might be. And it's Dr. Corbett, actually at U of M, who convinces pioneering environmental health scientist Irving Selikoff, who's at Mount Sinai in New York, to come to Michigan in 1976. And Selikoff says, I can't come without an invitation from the state. So Dr. Corbett contacts the governor's office and ends up connecting with a legislative aide for one of our representatives out of Flint at the time, and he ends up issuing an invitation. So Selikoff comes in 1976 and sets up a clinic in Grand Rapids. They do some general population research and work, in addition to investigating mostly farm families' exposures to see what some of the immediate health responses to this is, but also kind of set a foundation for what some of the long-term implications might be. There's a chemical worker study that happens, as well as the state gets funding from a consortium of federal agencies to start the Michigan PBB long-term health study, which we know today as the Michigan PBB Registry. Act 77 is another powerful example of community action that helped to provoke a response. So this is actually, the policy as it's written is shaped by a meeting that the PBB Action Committee had at CMU, of all places, so ironic, on March 20th in 1976. Nearly 300 farm families and residents attended this meeting in Warner Hall and developed a list of demands. These 3 bullet points ended up in Act 77. They were among that list of demands. So loans to farmers who were affected. These ended up being really hard to get. Only quarantined farmers were eligible for it, and there was a ton of paperwork. You had to provide significant documentation and evidence. So there were only a few farms that actually ended up benefiting from that. There's funding for the Michigan Long-Term PBB Study, again now known as the Registry, and then further reduced actionable level. Okay, so the costs of this were tremendous, this disaster. So in trying to calculate, what is the economic outcome of this? Well, in terms of agriculture, in 1976, the state estimated that this cost Michigan Ag $75 million approximately. That's significantly more than any of these other accidents. By 1979, the estimated cost rose to $215 million. $215 million in today's dollars approaches $1 billion. That's just what we know from quarantined farms. That doesn't necessarily account for low-level farmers. That doesn't include what's the cost for people who are, affected by this in terms of their health care. How much money has been pumped into the long-term health research? How much money is it going to take to clean up the chemical sites in St. Louis, the chemical firm? To date, we are at $400 million to clean up Velsicol's mess. Okay, so George Freeze, who again is this scientist who helps Rick Halbert confirm this disaster happened in 1985, publishes an article, and he makes this observation. The controversies associated with the PBB episode have receded from public awareness. Generally, the controversies were not resolved by interpretations of scientific findings, but rather they were resolved by political and legal decisions or by the passage of time. The major unresolved question that remains concerns the possible long-term effects of PBB exposure to human health, which feels so eerie to read. in 2024. And in fact, he's right. By the mid-1980s, most Michiganders were ready to move on. This was a very traumatic experience for many of them. Others, simply had the impression that the disaster was over, that this was no longer an issue. And in fact, that was far from accurate, right? So in 1992, Channel 9 and 10 News produced a 5-part series, PBB, a look back almost 20 years after the disaster, where George McGowan, who is the investigative reporter who did the series, interviewed a number of people, including members of the CAG in St. Louis, about what's been going on with this since the 70s. And essentially, they revived interest or demonstrated that there was persistent interest in trying to clean up the mess and trying to understand what the long-term health implications might be. Okay, so this is in the 1990s. Simultaneously, Dr. Michelle Marcus writes a proposal to do some research with the Michigan PBB cohorts to try to see what some of those long-term health impacts might be. The Pine River Superfund Citizen Task Force forms in St. Louis, Michigan in 1997, following an EPA emergency removal action that revealed that the first cleanup of the site failed. So we're now in the midst of the second major cleanup. We're hoping we don't need a third. And so Dr. Marcus, writes these proposals and ends up in the early 2000s when the state can no longer maintain the registry. Emory University takes on that work, and along with Melanie Peterson and Teresa Terrell, they're all here tonight, they ground this work in community engaged research, and they really turned to the community to try to understand what people's experiences are with this as a way to try to find ways to then respond to those needs and concerns. So they hold these annual meetings, and at these annual meetings, community meetings, we just had 2 this past weekend, they discovered that the community has knowledge that can help to inform and improve the kind of research on health effects that they were doing. They witnessed and heard really powerful stories that they knew needed to be documented and preserved. And then they saw that the meetings were an opportunity to try to understand how people understand their exposure, how they translate that knowledge, but also what their capacity to respond at the time of the disaster and in the decades since is or has been, how that's evolved. And so this led to collaboration on an oral history project and the early kind of engagement with CMU. So Norm, who you're going to hear from in a little bit here, called me and said, hey, there's this group from Emory University coming up. They're doing this long-term health study, and we think it's really important to document the stories we're hearing. And so we met, and we decided to pursue an oral history project. So with the partners at Emory and the University of Michigan, we got funding to do an oral history project. So we interviewed around 70 community members, and that was a way to record and document their experiences and memories of the PBB disaster. And those materials are going to go to the Museum of Cultural and Natural History at CMU. We've got about 80 hours of audio, a couple thousand pages of transcriptions. You can kind of see the breakdown of people that we spoke with. In addition to the oral history project, actually Norm inspired the creation of a community archive at the Clarke Historical Library here at CMU. He met Dr. Alpha Clarke and convinced him to donate his papers to the Clarke. When we went out and did our interviews, we also had community members say, hey, I've got these papers, do you want them? And at community meetings, community members approached us and said, hey, I've got these papers. And so we've been collaborating with the Clarke, Marion Mayton, the archivist, to build this repository, this collection of information tied to community experiences. you'll have a chance actually to see some of the materials at the reception after the talk tonight. Okay, so the oral histories, this community archive, it's an extension of the work that community members have been doing for 50 years now, right? They established a really important community presence in the historical record, one that was rife with gaps, right? It tended to privilege expert opinion and those of public officials and agencies. So these resources help to address that. Okay, again, these sources, they demonstrate the persistence of community action, the depth of community knowledge, and compassion and concern among community members. So it wasn't surprising then, in 2023, actually 2022, when community members started talking about the 50th anniversary of this disaster, and we decided that we needed to do something to mark that moment. I'm going to turn things over to Ben.
So I became involved with this without knowing what it was I was getting involved with, to be entirely honest. I'm from the West Coast. I knew nothing about this a few years ago. But a friend came to me at Alma College and said, hey, you've worked on some grants in the past. There's this story, I think it's really meaningful. We're going to do a conference around it. We could use some help on that. Would you like to come on board? And I said yes. And that small decision was life-changing for me. Because shortly thereafter, I started talking with people who had been affected, who had been living in this reality for 50 years. And I realized how ignorant I was of it, how much this was something that had disappeared. And I wanted to be a part of trying to do something to bring this back into the public consciousness in a meaningful way. But we had a problem, a difficulty. How do you commemorate a disaster with this scale of complexity, importance, and emotion? And the only thing we could really come up with was to collaborate with lots of people. We had long meetings with about 14 people on the organizing committee. First and most importantly, we managed to get some funding from the Michigan Humanities Council. And this would actually prove to be kind of the core of what we ended up doing, because as it was a humanities grant, we always had to be doing something interesting and innovative. We had to think about, how does this connect to philosophy? How does this connect to literature? How does it connect to art? How does it connect to dance? Because we had to do that, we had to bring a lot more people around the table. We had to bring artists and philosophers around the table. But also, we knew that we needed to bring in people from every group that had been affected, and we did our best to try to get everyone around the table and talk about what kind of commemoration would be appropriate, what kind of commemoration would be meaningful. And I think the thing that we developed out of that was quite innovative. Let's just list a few of the things. Some of my students did a podcast on it. Dance students interpreted the disaster through movement, ultimately at the conference. Community members created an exhibit of art inspired by the disaster. And we had various virtual opportunities, because obviously not everyone could make it out to Alma, Michigan to be at the conference. And all of this actually started to take off in a way that was truly amazing. Suddenly, we had more people who wanted to come to share what they had experienced, to hear from other people, than we had space for. We had planned this to be about 90 people, and in the end, we had well over 200. Now, there were a few difficulties that came up with that. For those of you who were there, you remember it was in a basketball arena. It was because we had to sort of pivot. but we did, and it was fantastic. The other thing too was that we started to get a lot of media interest, both in terms of television reporters, newspaper reporters, but also a documentary crew came down and did sort of preliminary work. And the EPA provided us some funding to do our own sort of internal documentary on it as well. The actual conference was profound. It was a moment in which people came together to share their experiences, to hear from experts, but also to connect those experiences in ways that were maybe surprising. And this, again, I would go back to the Humanities Council on this. That because we had funding from them, we had to bring in people to talk about environmental philosophy. We had to bring in people to think about art and how it connects to it. But we also had just fantastic panels, and at the end of it, something that I think all of us who had been involved in the organizing committee felt was that this had been something that had deeply impacted us. And we didn't want it to end just with the conference. This was the plan originally, and the conference was the thing. And this is just, this photo here is just a moment from this interpretive dance that some students did, and whether you are into interpretive dance or not, the point was that every one of those students there felt a profound emotional connection to the topic in a way that I think we all found moving and profound. And we saw that again and again and again. So what could we do to keep it going, to try to keep telling that story? The first approach was, of course, the book, which we'll have copies of at the reception. The PBB Disaster at 50. This book attempted to not only capture the facts and the reality, but to really be an anthology that captured the feeling and the emotion of the event. Thanks to some absolutely superlative design work by, I'm somewhat proud, one of my students, Charlene Aya Oligario, and also my research assistant, Katie Brugones. They used layout to try to bring in the art that had been produced by community members who were responding to the disaster to sort of offset the essays and express things in a different way. This particular one, I ended up next to my piece in it, and it just really sort of evokes something, I think. Of course, this isn't the end. We are planning on doing many things. We still have some EPA environmental justice money that we're working with. So we are holding follow-up events. You might be at one of them. Right? But also we're in the process of working on a digital archive where we can expand access to materials that are available online. At Alma College, we are working with the education department there to develop curriculum that will ultimately, hopefully, be going into high schools. We are also working with the State Archive around the Governor's Decision Room series, which is a series in which there are simulations of events, and they're planning on doing one on PBB. We're also going to try to get this book spread as wide as we can, so that people have something that they can actually pick up and look at that will try to capture what was so meaningful about this. Wrong way. So just a couple of quick notes from me about maybe what I took away from all this. The first is that people really do care about this story. as soon as we started working on this, as soon as we put it out through networks that this was a thing that was happening, people came to us. They wanted to help, they wanted to support, they were interested, they were engaged. The second thing is perhaps sort of personal. By integrating a lot of art into the conference and into the book, it really struck me how much art can express something, can try to capture this moment in a way that is, in this case, heartbreaking and profound. I also think that this teaches us something about the role that colleges and universities need to play in communities. There were many things that we could do to support this because of the structure of a college or a university. Higher education has certain capacities that allow it to be a catalyst for doing this kind of work in communities. I think we sometimes forget that role, honestly. Both the public and sometimes our own institutions. But we should be that kind of critical center. And the final thing, this is just personal for me, is that I'm always the newcomer into this. Like I said, kind of was faintly aware of things about 5 years ago, wasn't really involved until about 2. And I am just always amazed by the people involved. And the kind of heroes that have emerged, the kind of long-term work that people have put in around this issue, the empathy, the resilience, the strength that people have shown. It is something that is absolutely humbling to me. I feel profoundly honored and in many ways unworthy to be a part of this. But I can only say, in conclusion, I guess, that there are many things that need to be done, and there are many wrongs that need to be righted. But I do think we've moved some of the needles, little by little. And I think that that is something that I really hope we continue doing as a community. I think that's my piece.
Okay, so at the conference, we had a series of opening remarks that were delivered and keynotes, and Norm, who has brought me into the community and introduced me to our partners and been such an important part of the documenting. He's a lover of history, and I think he's seen from the outset the importance of preserving these stories and experiences. I have so much gratitude for the work he's done. So he, of course, as Carrie mentioned at the beginning, is an epidemiologist, not just for Mid-Michigan District Health Department, but he actually has a super district. They call it the Norm District. It's 2 other districts. Over 50 years in public health as an epidemiologist. He is a PBB registry partner and a long-serving member of the Pine River Superfund Citizen Task Force. And he was going to deliver some opening remarks at the conference and couldn't be there. And then he was going to read his remarks at an event we had this past April, and he couldn't be there. So third try is a charm. Tonight, Norm is finally going to have an opportunity to read his remarks that he wrote for the conference. So please welcome Norm.
This was from a point in time going back to last year when the original conference was held. So some of it is a little dated in a way. I grew up here in St. Louis and still live just north of town on the Pine River. I still work after 55 years in public health. My maternal grandfather helped start the chemical plant around 1935. He was the power plant operator, which was steam back then. You ever wish you could bring back a relative and ask them just a few more questions? Yeah. I remember sitting on my dad's desk in the accounting office and playing with his manual adding machine at the Michigan Chemical Corporation. He didn't work in the production area. You could say that the plant has been a part of our family history for generations. Until the age of 5, I lived 3 blocks east of the plant. Then we moved over downstream, a block from the dam, still fairly close. I grew up playing along the Pine River. Hours and hours, days and days. My dog Peggy and I explored along it. My father said, "Don't go in the water, Normie." Through junior high and high school, I played with my friend Joel, who lived a block south of the main plant entrance. We used to sneak into the back property of the plant to hunt frogs and get some sulfur to experiment with. You know, you can make some interesting stuff with sulfur. His father used to repaint their house every few years because he said the chemical plant fumes ruined the paint. My friend Tom's dad was a machinist at the plant. He could fix anything, make any part. He went everywhere in the plant to fix anything mechanical, meanwhile being exposed to everything. I began riding motorcycle back then, and he enjoyed discussing engines and machinery with me. After retiring, he and his wife lived in St. Louis for a number of years. Then they moved to Florida, where their son Tom lived. Mr. Brady died of a rare stomach cancer, and Tom is in a nursing home with advanced Parkinson's disease right now as I speak. He's since died. I am an epidemiologist. I understand that we need cause and effect in investigations, because there's always that lingering association isn't causation. That's a mantra that's been around forever. I wonder about that with Tom and his dad, and many other stories of sickness and maybe related to the plant, either by employment or geography. Time went by and I worked my first career at the Michigan Department of Public Health in Lansing, starting in 1971. I ran the state tuberculosis program for 27 years. I designed and supported the first microcomputer-based communicable disease reporting system in our state. I worked on large outbreaks, routinely visited all the county health departments, local health departments as we call them. I taught epi analysis to other employees and local health department personnel. And yes, I knew some of what was going on at the state level with their response to the PBB catastrophe. You've read the names of Drs. Isbister, Hayner, Humphrey. I knew all of them well. I did get pulled into their efforts in a very small way, but I had other job to do. We moved back to St. Louis in 1975 and ate carefully. Had our own goats for milk and chickens and rabbits, but we still got PBB in our bodies. I have a low blood level. We saw the plant demolished and the clay cap put on it. That clay came from a farm about a half a mile from where we live. It created a nice small lake for the landowner, but it didn't end up helping prevent pollution from the plant very well. Upon retirement, the local health departments wanted me as their epidemiologist. I knew the state had stopped following the cohort of farm families and employees, but I didn't know that Emory University researchers had picked up the ball and were continuing broader research. Then, 10 years ago, I heard through my friends at District Health Department number 10 that Emory had been in the Big Rapids area meeting with their citizens. I saw a way for public health to help keep advocating for research and the follow-up of our exposed citizens. I immediately wrote, a real letter to Michelle Marcus at Emory, who was with us at this conference, and she's with us here tonight, by the way. And we began working together. I aroused interest at my Mid-Michigan District Health Department, and my local health officers and nurses have rallied to support Emory's work. I've been on Emory's Citizens Advisory Board for many years, and our local Superfund Citizens Task Force. I believe strongly in public health and the impact that it does have and can have on our communities. I love the history of public health and the knowledge that history helps us to understand and shape our futures. Again, through a nurse at District 10, I met and became friends with Dr. Alpha Clarke, a veterinarian in Missaukee County who investigated what was happening to the herds he cared for, even before anyone knew what was happening with the feed. I wanted his legacy to live on. A presentation I gave to the historians right here at the Clarke Historical Library ignited their interest in preserving his important research records and papers on PBB. Interestingly and sadly, he passed away 1 year ago today. Still working at that time as a veterinarian for over 60 years. I have a lot of wonderful stories to tell about him. The family mentioned me in his obituary. What an honor. My desire to preserve PB history led me to Professor Brittany Fremion. We were congratulating each other here. You will hear from her at this conference, okay? She is leading the oral history project to save the memories and the emotions that our citizens have with PBB disaster. I have seen her student assistants in person choke up when they recall interviews that they've had with those citizens. If I could leave a legacy, it would be that I helped preserve, detail, and bring awareness to one of the most tragic events in United States history. So here we are, 50 years out, and saying that just seems strange to me, otherworldly, like a science fiction story. As we all know, there's been many other similar stories across America that have happened during all these years. But uniquely, we in the farm families mainly ate our way into being exposed, while the plant workers contended with immediate exposure. But even in the room where they ate lunch, some kind of dust was all over the place. I do, all the twists and turns that have happened over the years. Sometimes we may not know how it all happened, but today we do know exactly why we are here right at this moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Norm. Okay, so Norm's opening remarks from the conference are in the book. He gave us permission to reprint them, and we'll be handing those out when we go down the hall for the reception in a few minutes here. We thought about showing you the highlight reel from the conference, which is so incredibly moving and powerful. It really does a nice job of documenting the proceedings. It also has really great footage. There was a day where we did field trips, so we rented charter buses and had some St. Louis community members do guided tours around Gratiot County, especially the St. Louis area. And then our partners at EPA drove us through the former plant site because it was a rainy day. We couldn't do a walking tour. I encourage you to watch the video. It's only about 6 minutes long total, and it's actually on a website that I'm going to give you the QR code for here in a moment. So I hope you'll take the time to take a look at that. So in reflecting upon all of the work over the past 50 years, especially the work over the past 3, to do the conference as well as essay collection, there are a few things that we recognize this is really being important. And the first of which is that the community has really important knowledge that has shaped and driven action and continues to do so. The community is a really critical source, and I think it is almost irresponsible not to consult with and confer with them when it comes to figuring out ways to identify but then address their needs. So a really interesting outcome from the Oral History Project is an article that a group of collaborators at the University of Michigan, Emory, and CMU, along with community partners, you'll see Norm is a co-author on this paper as well. We did an analysis of a subset of oral history interviews to try to get a sense of what the emerging themes were from those interviews, and uncertainty and action were among those. Trust has been an issue among community members when it comes to public institutions and agencies for obvious reasons, but also how did those community members take action, and how did they translate their knowledge into action? What was their capacity to address this large-scale contamination then, and what's their capacity to continue doing that work now? So the QR code to that is open access, publicly available, and a really interesting study. The community has important knowledge that is also in the book that we are going to be handing out in a moment. This is a photo from an event we had in April at Alma College's ballroom, which in the Opera House, above Black House downtown. And it was a moment a year after the conference to not celebrate this disaster happening, but to celebrate and acknowledge community action and activism. And it was a powerful event. We released the book, we had several readings from the collection, and then we screened the highlight reel from the conference, in addition to a short film that students in one of my public history classes produced. That's on YouTube that I need to get up and made available to everyone because they did such a wonderful job with it. Partnerships are really important, and so is funding. That was something that really struck me coming out of community meetings this weekend, is how important investing in long-term research, health research especially, is. The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is part of the NIH, has funded a lot of the registry research. It also funded the Oral History Project, so we found really innovative and exciting ways to convince those institutions and funding agencies that are investigating and monitoring the long-term health impacts to identify community knowledge and really build upon that foundation. Michigan Humanities, of course, EPA provided funding. And so did Metz Culinary, the Pine River Arts Council, that's what Prague is down here. But then we have university partners, but look at these community partners. We have the PBB Citizens Advisory Board, which is a group of farm families, the Pine River Superfund Citizen Task Force, residents of St. Louis, former chemical workers, and then the Mid-Michigan District's Health Department. The Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe was also part of the conference, and you can find tribal elder testimony in the collection as well, Elder Salmick. So these partnerships have done a lot of really good things, and I think it's critical that we continue to honor them and build upon that momentum. Being resourceful is critical, and I mean this in a number of ways. Community members were really resourceful in the 1970s when it came to documenting the disaster and trying to figure out what was going on. Chemist turned farmer Rick Halbert is a really great example of that. Piloting studies on his own farm, calling and shipping samples of his feed to labs across the country, paying out of pocket to try to convince, the state vet and Farm Bureau, Michigan Chemical, and MDA that this is something that is actually really big and really problematic. Beyond being resourceful, sources really matter. The collections, the evidence that we have that's available include those at the Clarke here at CMU. Again, you'll get to see some examples when we go down the hall for the reception. The Archives of Michigan have got a lot of agency records and documents as well. In Lansing, the Museum of Cultural and Natural History here at CMU will preserve the oral histories. There are other university libraries that also have really important collections. So Alma College actually started the collection for the task force in St. Louis. We now have a duplicate collection or an expanded collection from the CAG here at the Clarke. The Bentley at the University of Michigan, for instance, has Isidore Bernstein's papers, which are, so she was a chemist and did some early research into the PBB disaster, some of the health effects. The University Archive and Historical Collections at MSU have Ted Jackson's papers. He was a veterinarian who worked with Rick Halbert to try to determine what was going on with herds. And he and Rick actually published a really important study early on as well. Beyond that, coming out of the conference, we had a conference website that is now a digital archive that documents and preserves the materials from the conference and from events like this. So it's a way to get access to a digital copy of the book for free. There's a link to the highlight reel. It's embedded in this website as well. You can find information about the conference proceedings there too, and all of our partners, which I think is really important. There's more work to do. This is our last reflection here. The cleanup in St. Louis is ongoing. We're actually getting to the point where we're talking about site reuse and redevelopment, but there's a lot of work that remains. If you are from St. Louis or have an interest in supporting the CAG, please come see me after this meeting. We're always looking for new members, but also to grow our connections and partnerships. The PBB registry, that research is critical. There's more work to do. We need more funding. We are looking for more collaborators to support that work as well. We need to engage the next generation. That's really important in this too, so the story isn't forgotten or lost. There is a film series being developed on this topic, a 5-part documentary series, so more to come on that. And then educational curriculum, which Ben mentioned. So there's a lot left to be done, and we hope that you will join us in that work. I just want to say thank you again for your time and contributions. Those of you who are community members who have shared your story, they've changed us for the long run and in a really good and important way. You can access the Michigan PBB Registry website through this QR code here, and then this is a link to that digital archive where you can also find that highlight reel from the conference. So, it is 8:07. I'm very long-winded. I learned this weekend that I'm long-winded. That was too late. Okay, is it okay? Okay, thanks.
Questions? This is the Q&A part of the evening, so if you let me know you want to ask a question, I'll whip the microphone at you or bring it to you, one or the other. Questions?
So you mentioned that you're doing curriculum for the schools, and how do you intend to get that into the school curriculum?
This one. That's a really good question. We're still figuring that out, to be entirely honest. There are a couple of things that we are doing, though. One of the most important things is that the structure of the curriculum is very intentionally designed to be something that teachers can easily put into the classroom. So one of the things that we've really talked quite a bit with the people who work in our education department about, particularly Professor Jessica Zager down there, is what can we actually do that will make this into something that somebody won't go, oh, I'm already doing so many other things, how am I supposed to add this in? So it's really intended to be very modular, and that we hope will then make it more available. The other thing too is that we're going to, once we actually have everything released, we're going to do sort of an outreach period to get out to people and talk about this as a potential resource. It will go up for free on the website eventually. That's kind of the plan. So it will also be very easily accessible in that way. But it is a real challenge, honestly. I mean, if you make curriculum and no one uses it, well, you didn't really achieve too much, did you? So it's something we're thinking about. If anyone has a classroom that they'd like some curriculum for, come talk with me. I'd be happy to make a connection.
Other questions?
Whoever did that, I couldn't figure out how.
Can you hear me? I would like to ask anybody, how can we revitalize what happened to the family farms? I was on the front lines of it. I was approximately 10, 11 years old when all this happened, and it decimated us. So anybody, if you have an answer, I speak to everybody because I go back to what my dad said. As long as we have enough to eat, we'll never have a civil war again in this country. But I'm nervous. I feel like it's right on the precipice, that it's close. And I don't want it to happen. But if I just bury my head in the sand, that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. So, anybody, give me an answer.
Okay, so a quick acknowledgement. John was the first person interviewed for the Oral History Project. So I just want to acknowledge and thank you for participating, trusting me, and for sharing your story. And I have kind of an answer. So one of our partners, Terry Appel, has been talking about vocational programs in high schools and how do we get those students trained, or how do we give them this knowledge, especially those that are going to end up on farms, on family farms, or working on farms. And I think that that's an important way. What about the rest of you? I appreciate this is shifting into a town hall discussion, kind of like at our registry meetings, which is very cool.
It seems like when kids are in 5th grade or something, there's a Michigan component that they have. Oh, yes. All right. Okay. There's a Michigan component that they have. It seems like this should be part of that. So is it something where we need to contact our legislators, or the Michigan Education group. But it would seem like this is so important to Michigan history that it should be taught at that level.
Yes, letter writing campaigns, please contact your representatives. This is something that we talk about at community meetings as well, especially involving long-term health, funding for blood draws to see what people's PBB levels are. We have a wait list of over 1,000 people waiting to have their blood tested, and knowing that number can be really critical to their care. If they can go to their doctor and their doctor knows what the disaster is, but then knows what their levels are, then they can associate that with some of the long-term risks. And that's going to mean for women, more frequent breast cancer screenings, that early intervention can be life-saving. Testing for thyroid problems, which are a really common long-term health issue. But right, so education is another space where we need to, I think, continue to grow the conversation. And maybe it's a policy that needs to be implemented. Maybe it's addressing the state standards and curriculum, the requirements. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I kind of was going to mention that immersing the contents in the Michigan standards. I think that there is plenty of room because you have all the history, but also the evolution of the problem and what's been done. I was going to ask if in your book, I didn't read the book, if there is any reference to the attempts of cleanups and also the other side of the story, what the company did, and because there is a very sad story there as well. And I think that knowledge is crucial, that we make sure that across all the levels, students get exposed, even though this is a sad story, but from all point of view, from history, but also from the science behind it. I teach an introductory science class here, and I ask my students, how many of you are from Michigan? Everybody raise their hands. How many of you know about the Velsicol plants and St. Louis? And nobody knows. Nobody knows. And we spend time talking about that, and many of those students are second generation of farmers, and they don't know about it. They don't know that was basically in their backyard. So definitely it needs to be immersed in the curriculum somehow, because if we don't know the story, we forget about it.
Thank you for building this into your class and doing that work. Thank you very much. Yeah, you're right. And I think that the collection is a really great primary source, or a source for students to learn about this disaster, right? History can be painful and traumatic and really hard, but it also teaches us compassion and empathy. It teaches us how to be responsible community members, how to be active and involved in community organizations and groups. It can teach us how to care about one another and how to take care of one another.
I'd like to offer something to what we're talking about here. That I'm a member of the community advisory group, the Pioneer Task Force. Unfortunately, I currently serve as the grant administrator and the treasurer, and I can't spend the money on things I'd really like to spend it on. But we tried to get our own school system, our high school, our grade school. Members of our group have gone and given talks at the school. They talked to members of the school board, the superintendents, and they really didn't want to offer any help to try to, very minimal. Just a couple of times did something happen. We worked on the EPA a little bit to try to get them to take something to the school system, and they have a thing called the Community Involvement Coordinator. Literally, her job is to make the EPA look good. And we know that for a fact because one of our members attended a workshop, and that's exactly what they were teaching. But the thing that they brought to the table was coloring books and crayons. And, you know, all in all, that's not a bad thing for the grade schoolers. You know, they would take it home and start talking to their parents and but what we've gotten from all of that is the belief that it was such a tough struggle to get the city to acknowledge our group and what we were trying to do to get everything cleaned up, because it was such a negative thing. It pulled in all kinds of bad feelings and memories and Toxic Town USA, there it is. You know, birds are falling out of the sky. You know, who wants to move to St. Louis? You know, so I think there's an element there that speaks to, well, we'd rather look the other way than talk about it. And how do we get past that is really a good question, and we haven't figured it out yet.
Yeah, that stigma the community carries still, despite this massive cleanup. I mean, they've removed so much of the contamination, and again, we're talking about site redevelopment and reuse, so there's hope there. And let's also find the hope in this story, the hope that comes with community activism, the hope that comes with the development of curriculum. So Rachel Clarke at the Archives of Michigan, she was a former museum educator, and she's building out this governor's decision room simulation. And part of the simulation is actually bringing students to the Capitol and going through this exercise. Okay, you're Governor Milliken, you've got this council, this cabinet, what are you gonna do? You just found out that this PBB disaster happened. What action do you take? And you have to make your decision based upon the primary sources that are available, and that's how you learn about it, which is, I think, a really important way of learning too, that applied kind of learning space. So.
Is there any information on what the actual effects on human health of the PBB?
Yes, and we have the experts right here, so this is perfect. Yeah, Dr. Marcus.
I spent 30 minutes talking about the health effects at community meetings yesterday and the day before. My voice is shot, but I'll try to summarize in 5 minutes. People who so there's a lot of things about PBB. It is very resistant to degradation in the environment and in the human body. It has a very long half-life. It takes about 12 years for your body to get rid of half of the PBB that you had in your body. People who were exposed as adults were more likely to have thyroid problems, and so it's really important to let your physician know that you might be at higher risk of thyroid problems if you were exposed. We found that women had a higher risk of breast cancer. Don't skip your mammograms, because we know that the earlier diagnosis is really important for survival. There's also some evidence of an increased risk of lymphoma and gastrointestinal cancers, although that's based on small numbers, and we are currently working with the state, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, to update the cancer information so that we can look at this again. The most disturbing part of the research was finding that the children of women who were highly exposed were exposed in the womb and through breast milk, and the girls born to highly exposed women matured earlier. They were likely to have their first menstrual period earlier than unexposed girls, and as adults they're more likely to have miscarriages. We found that the boys who were exposed in the womb to highly exposed moms were more likely to have problems of the urinary and genital tract, and they had slower growth and pubertal development. We found that in a lot of ways, looking at gene activity, that PBB acts like a weak estrogen, which makes sense that it accelerated female development, it slowed down male development, and increased the risk of breast cancer. We also found, looking at some of the metabolic changes, that it also impacts immune function, and so there's an increase in certain types of autoimmune disorders, and also some inflammation and oxidative stress pathways, which really kind of increases your risk for just a lot of other disorders. So it's a really, really sad story. And we have been, working with the community to try to tailor the research. We found that it has this very long half-life, so we tried to design a study to see if we could speed up elimination of PBB. I won't tell you all the details because unfortunately it didn't work. So we don't know at the current time how to help you eliminate the PBB. So anything else? Right, so the father's exposure, so this is interesting. If the mother has PBB in their body, it crosses the placenta, the child unfortunately gets directly exposed to the PBB. Now the father only contributes his DNA, but we found that the PBB, it doesn't cause a mutation in the DNA, it doesn't break the DNA like ionizing radiation does, but it alters the gene expression. And we were able to look at 4 genes in the sperm of men who were highly exposed, and one of them had abnormal activity. So when we looked at that, we looked at a few things. The children of men who were highly exposed were likely to have lower birth weight. So it did impact their growth. And I always forget about the APGAR scores. So an APGAR score is the newborn's condition at birth, and it's like on a scale of 0 to 10. So the newborns of women who were highly exposed were more likely to have a lower APGAR score at birth. So there's, now we're looking at things, again, that are concern of the community, like joint problems, joint replacement. People have talked a lot about that. We're looking at aging, how this impacts people who are exposed as they age, and looking at whether it affects, cognitive decline, memory as you age. And also reproductive aging, since it impacts the reproductive system. How does that impact women going through menopause and postmenopausal? Anything else? Okay. Questions?
You mentioned how it affects.
Thank you.
You mentioned how it affects adults who are exposed, and you also mentioned how it affects the children of people who are exposed, but does it affect children with direct exposure any differently, or is it pretty similar to
Right. So we haven't been able to isolate, the impact on children. So generally, the stages of development where you're most vulnerable to a toxic exposure is in utero, and then in early childhood, prepubertal, and then, as an adult. Now, actually, the finding, the hormone levels, right. So in the children. So we looked at hormone levels of women who were exposed as children, and we did find that they had lower estrogen levels throughout their menstrual cycle. And we think that's because in some ways, since PBB is acting like a weak estrogen, that the body is compensating by making less endogenous estrogen. But we didn't, but we really weren't able to look at whether there were pregnancy consequences. Like were they less likely to conceive or have pregnancy losses? That is something that we want to pursue. Then we did, so that was women who were exposed pre-puberty, right, wasn't it? Okay, and then we looked at the daughters, okay, of highly exposed women, and that's the same group that had earlier menarche and miscarriages, and their hormonal patterns were different. They had elevated progesterone levels, and we really don't know why that is. So we're trying to understand that, and we are, wanting to study, and this is an important thing, that we want to reach out to the younger people who may have been exposed as children or who were born to parents who were highly exposed, to really see what the long-term health effects might be in them.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop there because this is all very interesting, but I think we want to move along to the Clarke, where the